Welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm delighted to have Sara Wallace Goodman from University of California, Irvine be joining us, presenting her work on her recent published book on citizenship in hard times. And she was actually supposed to give this talk a year ago. No, at the beginning of, it was March 2020. You were supposed to give this talk and we canceled it along with everything else in the world.
It's still March 2020. I don't know what you're talking about.
It's totally appropriate that we are giving your March 2020 talk right now.
Yeah.
And everything's normal and fine, right? We just lost 2 years. And so again, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Kaija Schilde. I'm the Center for the Study of Europe Director and the Jean Monnet Chair in European Security and Defense. And we welcome you, Sara. And so just before starting, for attendees, please use the Q&A function to ask any questions, and then Sara can see them, and I can also read them to her, but we welcome your comments. And also, Sara and I know each other, and so it's going to be impossible for us to use doctor honorifics with each other. So we will refer to each other in the first person, if that's okay. All right, Sara, please.
Okay, let me go ahead and accurately adjust this. I'll just be Sara today. Good. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for welcoming me to Boston. I'm still here, so it's like Boston with warmer weather, I suppose. And I'm really happy to present to you my book, which is, when we first scheduled this, in progress and is now a physical, actual manifested book. It's been that long of a pandemic, but I'm really happy to be here today and share with you some of my findings about citizenship in hard times, what ordinary people do, how they respond to democratic threat. So, there's a lot of parts to this. It's like a full book, so I'm only gonna, take the very limited time I have today to do kind of a bit of a preview of some of the descriptive findings. So I want to start just kind of by clarifying, like, what are we talking about when I mean democratic threat, right? Because that could be a lot of things. Today, it would mean citizens fighting in Ukraine, right? Because that is a clear democratic threat when a country invades you, and taking up arms is a type of civic obligation. So in one sense, that's true, but that is not the kind of democratic threat I'm talking about in my book, and not the kind of threat that I look at norms to understand civic behavior or civic attitudes. Because this is like an external invasion. What I'm considering in my book, what I'm really curious about is the kind of ordinary day-to-day codician erosion, the kind of institutional rot that we see, that we experience, the backsliding, the slippage of norms, the undermining of democratic practices. When the system changes around you, how do citizens respond? What do they think is their role in this kind of macro change? So a lot of things qualify as a type of democratic threat in this sense. So in 2016, we had this kind of outsider candidate with these weak commitments to liberal democratic norms, what you could describe as kind of an uncomfortable admiration for authoritarian strongmen, like a toxic mix of xenophobia and racial politics, right? And I would add, like, little deference to the Constitution. So, this is one clear kind of democratic threat that I consider, that I look at. Foreign interference in elections, the extent to which you could facilitate or not penalize perpetrators, right? That's sort of in category. Certainly also the erosion of liberal democratic values among citizens, right? That is a clear type of threat, right? It undermines the foundation upon which democratic legitimacy rests, which, as the image shows, culminates in the, violent January 6th insurrection. So, these kinds of instances, they only lay bare sort of the fragility of American democratic institutions, that which preserves counter-majoritarian institutions, things like voter suppression, gerrymandering, right? To a significant subset of the US population, they experience persistent second-class citizenship, which we could also consider a type of democratic threat. But this is a European politics talk. So I've shown you 3 pictures already from the US. But there's a real value in being a comparativist and holding up democratic cases that are transatlantic in this sense, because from the US perspective, we look at these erosions that have happened, depending on what date you start, and we're like, wow, like this is a new and surprising thing. And like Europeans have long been experiencing this type of democratic slippage and have become far more practiced with dealing with anti-democratic and illiberal politics. I mean, that's not to say that familiarity makes a quotidian or has inured the continent to liberalism or to democratic instability, but that we can find comparisons between the US and between European cases to kind of try and build a generalized understanding about democratic citizenship more generally, what democratic citizens do in democratic hard times. So, we look at European cases and we don't see the kind of gerrymandering or voter suppression exercises that we see in the United States, but we do see, vast national populist parties gaining alarming amounts of support, right, from the AfD in Germany, or, pick your European country, France, Austria, Denmark, Switzerland, Netherlands, right, I don't know, pick one, right? So this broader populist transformation that's taking place across the continent. And in this case, much like gerrymandering or court appointments, we see how democratic actors use tools to undermine democracy. Okay. And it's not just sort of these elite democratic actors. We see our typical measures of mobilization, our typical measures of democratic participation, motivated by clearly illiberal thinking, right? Illiberal incentives or illiberal goals. So, people march, and we typically use marching as a sign of democratic health or a sign of political participation, but not when those marches are for undemocratic or illiberal reasons. And the past, decade or so, we've seen both kinds of marches, or like in France with the Yellow Vests. It's like this mix where you had like Marxists and anti-Semites alongside authoritarian, right, sort of everyone was showing up for the party. So you have all of these kinds of incidences taking place on the continent, and then like the rejection of sort of macro liberal ideas themselves. So when sometimes people choose illiberalism, so it's not just voting for the AfD, but you could choose an illiberal idea, right? So when the UK voted to narrowly voted to exit the European Union, which is like a political economic, I don't need to tell this audience, or political economic organization that strives for shared prosperity and democratic commitments. Here you see voters reject kind of the international liberal order itself, the idea, its physical manifestation in the form of the EU. So all these macro, all these changes are taking place. It's hard times for democracy overall. US, Europe, you could go to Turkey, Brazil, Israel, India, right? So as this sort of exclusionary populism has surged, I want to understand what citizens do. Like, where are they in this story? Because most of our stories, just to summarize, right? So we can understand democratic threat here are really just events that cause the integrity of democratic institutions to be undermined, right? That we can erode, or the recession, the backsliding, there are all these terms for it. But we're really talking about kind of manifest signals that institutions are under threat. That they will not be reliably there for the next iteration, right? An election or voting or participation. So given that, most of our accounts are what elites do. And elites are really central to the story. I'm not in any way saying that elites don't play a significant role, right? They're the institutional guardrails, and they can also eliminate institutions. They can, it is the work of the incumbents that can erode democracy directly. And they communicate strong signals, strong cues to citizens about how they should think about hard times, how they should think about democratic debt. So elites play a really critical role. But at the same time, citizens are not just kind of passive recipients of these cues. So they can choose among them in kind of a more competitive media market, but they can pick and choose between signals, even if signals are really strong. And mass politics is not merely kind of the field where these elite politics play out. So citizens do think more than just vote for autocrats, right? Citizens can maintain a set of norms that enable cross-cutting networks. Citizens can value certain aspects of gatekeeping that can either make a society more inclusive or less inclusive. So democracy, by definition, right, draws sovereignty from its citizens. Citizens are a source of democratic legitimacy. And through participation and maintaining liberal value commitments, it not only kind of shapes elite preferences in turn, right, but it kind of maintains and defines group goals that these regimes are purported to preserve or deliver, right? What are the national goals that elected leaders are supposed to pursue? They are defined by the electorate, right? So citizens play a really critical role in kind of setting the stage in which authoritarian power grabs can take place or democratic slippage can occur. So where are the citizens? So what this project does is put citizens under a microscope. It flips the script, turns around and looks at the citizens directly. Like, what are they doing? How do they see their role in these democratic hard times? We know a lot about the elites, but how are they listening? What do they view as threatening or not? And what do they think their role is? So what I ask directly is, what makes good citizens in hard times? How do individuals define civic obligation in hard times? So some of the central questions that this book addresses, in addition to what makes a good citizen in hard times, is how are norms affected by democratic threat? And what role does partisanship play? So in particular, what the book does that's really novel is thinking through partisanship as a social identity in competition with citizenship as a social identity. So both of these things are important identities. They tell you, people derive self-esteem from in-group identification. People use that to gatekeep between insiders and outsiders. But ostensibly, if you live in a liberal democracy, your citizenship identification, your set of civic principles and commitments should usurp partisan differences. That there should not be anything incompatible with being a Democrat lowercase d and a Democrat capital D, right? But what I do is sort of I center this question, and I think critically about when these identities can compete with one another. And as partisanship is kind of the membership category that inserts individuals into the political process, I think through these types of threats where citizens may not see something as threatening because it doesn't benefit their party or because it may hurt their party. And so, so first I think through how social identities compete and what makes a citizen choose one versus the other in the face of democratic threat. The stakes are really high, right? Hard times need citizens, not partisans, because it is regime level threat that we're talking about. So to preview the argument that I make in the book, I show that threat affects citizenship norms. So citizenship norms change in hard times. Basically, the way that political scientists have thought about citizenship norms up until this point is that they're created by generational change or socioeconomic change. But here I'm looking at kind of regime level shocks, and that these democratic threats do affect citizenship norms. One thing that they do is that they sever some of the consensus, the cross-cutting values that allow for diversity of values to flourish. And I show that the type of threat matters. So citizens don't always respond to threat. Citizens don't respond to all democratic threats in the same way. We wouldn't expect them to. But when you present someone with like the threat of foreign interference in elections, and you tell them that undermining the integrity of our elections is a serious problem, they would necessarily respond differently than if you talk about gerrymandering, or maybe something much more localized, like the availability of polling at your usual polling place. So, people respond to threats differently, and they respond based on their set of incentives. So one of these incentives is defined by partisanship. It defines what your interest is in this threat. Does it threaten your status quo if you're a supporter of the incumbent party, or does it assist in your advantage, right? Can you gain something in disrupting the status quo? So that's the first element in which partisanship really shapes a citizen's understanding of obligation in hard times. And the second is institutions, or the context in which those interests are defined. So I do this 3-case comparison in the book where I look at what I call 3 typical cases. So the US, Germany, and the United Kingdom. I look at these 3 cases because they're typical in a sense that Ullman and Verba looked at them in mapping the original sort of understanding of civic culture and norms. So they're typical in that sense, but they also maximize a kind of important variation for understanding the context in which people identify incentives in responding to threat, right? So you take the US, which has like a zero-sum political system, first past the post, 2-party system, maximally polarized. And you can compare it to the UK, which is also a first past the post system, but with multi-parties. So you can gain some kind of institutional leverage there for understanding, what happens maybe when partisan identification is a little weaker, right, in a multi-party system. And then I include Germany because it's not only a multi-party system, but it has a form of proportional representation, which lowers the costs, right? So instead of having a zero-sum political system, it has what's called a positive sum, a more consensus-based system. You essentially have more times at bat. There's more iterations, so costs of cooperation are lower. So the incentives to respond to threat are different than in a zero-sum system. So the book does a lot of things. I know I don't have time to go over nearly, that's why there's a book, and I really encourage you guys to pick it up and have a look. So in addition to kind of examining what citizens do in hard times, there's some features of the book itself. It has nationally representative survey data from 3 countries. It offers a new conceptualization of democratic citizenship norms. It toggles between the partisan and citizen obligations that I just spoke about. And it looks at citizen responses or obligations to 2 types of democratic threat. So I look at foreign interference in elections, and I look at polarization. So, that's all the book. What I want to do today is really just kind of lightly overview some of the descriptive findings, just kind of paint a picture about what values citizens hold in these 3 democracies. So what do I mean by norms? I keep using this term, and I'm using it kind of interchangeably with obligation and with civic duty. Essentially, they are this shared set of expectations about a citizen's role in politics. So what should citizens do? So, ask yourself, what makes a good citizen? So this is extremely context dependent, right? If I asked you in response to this image, what makes a good citizen, you would tell, and I told you this was from Ukraine, you would tell me, a good citizen fights for their country. A good citizen, defends democratic principles. If I asked you, what makes a good citizen in response to I picture people wearing masks, right? In the times of COVID, you might tell me that a good citizen wears a mask, or a good citizen defends medical exemptions. I don't know everyone on this call, but right. So what makes a good citizen is extremely context dependent. And that's really hard to study when the context itself can be in dispute. So we have to agree that something is threatening. And that makes it challenging to study democratic threat. And I think we've all seen this, right? When Republican leadership referred to the January 6th as legitimate political discourse. Right? So we have to agree that something is threatening in order to provoke a response, first off, but we realize then that the very nature of threat itself can be politicized. And political. So context is a very important part of this story. So we need kind of a really broad-based definition of what norms is and a really broad-based operationalization of it to allow for all different types of attitudes and behaviors to flow from these norms. So norms, again, expectations, obligations, duty, we can sort of think of these terms interchangeably. They place individuals in the larger democratic picture. So what is my role as citizen in this kind of larger story? Some use it to diagnose the health of a representative democracy, right? A democracy is only as strong as its democratic citizens. And importantly, there is a large literature that already shows that norms precede and shape behaviors and attitudes. Sometimes this affects redistributive outcomes. Sometimes this determines things like voting and protesting, right? So we know people vote. Voting is not in of itself a measure of democratic health if they're voting for autocrats, right? If they're voting for illiberal policies or leaders. So norms precede this kind of behavior. So it really lets us get at what individuals think in terms of their role in democracy. So what I offer in the book is an expansive definition of citizenship norms to include not just behavior, which is largely what the literature looks at so far, whether you're engaged, whether you're dutiful, whether you're critical, whether you're allegiant, right? So far kind of citizenship norms literature thinks kind of about behavior, like what citizens do. But I have to, but what I build here is a more expansive definition that includes not just behavior or how people think they should act, but also what they believe and how they co-identify. So what do I mean by that? Times have changed. One of the features about hard times is that the problem isn't low participation. So when we think about problems of democracy in the 90s or earlier, remember the 90s? It's great. Right. When we think about kind of the earlier problems of politics, of democratic politics, it was low participation. But times have really changed and concerns have expanded, right? So institutional checks and holding up norms, the inherent xenophobia or populism that we see in democratic systems, requires kind of a larger battery of potential items to make a good citizen, things that we may not have thought about earlier. So in populist times, we can't take for granted that sort of just that good citizens are engaged, right? Or good citizens are critical. We want to know whether they accept or reject liberal values. We want to know if they see it as their obligation to uphold the mantle of liberalism in hard times. So I add these two additional dimensions. I think of them as buckets, right? That you have sort of one set of value, one bucket which contains items of behavior. So a good citizen votes, a good citizen is informed, a good citizen joins associations. And then the second is a set of kind of beliefs, liberal value commitments. A good citizen has friends with different opinions. A good citizen accepts diversity. Sort of some, equality, like the things that exist, or maybe solidarity as part of kind of expansive definitions of liberal democracy or maximal definitions of liberal democracy. And then the third is attributes of belonging, the third bucket. So what it means to be a good citizen. If you ask some people, the answer might be a good citizen speaks English, right? They may have a latent sort of screen where they think about insiders and outsiders and border maintenance, right? Sort of social border maintenance. For some people, they derive self-esteem from gatekeeping. So we need to think about whether that plays a role in people's kind of civic obligations, right? Is maintaining sort of the boundaries of the national community. So I think of behavior, beliefs, and belongings, and I forward in the book this kind of new conceptualization for democratic citizenship. In the book, what I do is I present 14 different items of good citizenship, and I let people rate how important they are. this is just kind of a snapshot of how they group. What I do in the book is I have a factor analysis that kind of allows for these items to load together if they highly interrelate. So for example, right, I had this idea going into, before I fielded the surveys that, all these items might matter, but I didn't know how they mattered. So like obeying the law, for instance, you could argue is a really strong liberal value. It is, right? Obeying the law. It's also a really important behavior, but it highly interrelates with people that also rate feeling British as important. It also relates to people that say speaking English is really important. So this kind of builds a profile of, what you could call an allegiant citizen. Like this is the kind of highly ideal profile of a citizen that authoritarians would love to have, right? They're patriotic, they're obedient, they're nationalistic, right? So that's interesting, it's worrying, and I'll show you kind of how it crops up in some of the findings. So I'm not going to show you all 14 items. That was a mistake on my part to think that like 14 items is a sustainable number to study in 3 countries across 2 different crises. But I finished in the end, but it was a big haul. I'll just show you some of them given time constraints. So these are sort of some of the items from a group. I wanted to show that my original surveys in 2019, in some of them I replicate items off of the International Social Survey Program, which sort of asked similar questions in 2004 and 2014. So for some of these items, I could kind of track them over time. So we see, for example, on the left, this is a good citizen always votes, probably the most classic norm, right, that we think of in democracies. US has always valued it as high, right? So each of these countries, each of these lines represents a different country, right? So US has always rated this highly. The 2 European cases, rated it more highly in 2014, converging then in 2019. On the right, we have keeps watch on government, sort of the classic liberal value, vigilance, right? Always keeping government at it from a disposition of distrust or at an arm's length. And here we see that there's divergences among the European cases in 2014, which is something I talk about in the book, and that we still see a little more variation in 2019 when it comes to vigilance. The Americans here remain the most vigilant, followed by UK and Germany. So those are kind of the behavioral items. Again, some of these are replications, some of these are original to the survey. So some of the original items that I add, so I only have measures for 2019, are those liberal democratic values that I talked about are so important in hard times, in times of populism and institutionalized xenophobia. So some of these liberal values are having friends with different political views. Some of these are accepting diversity, is patient, recognizing that sometimes your side wins, sometimes your side loses, or what we call forbearance. So these are kind of liberal values that strongly interrelate with one another and tell us kind of how much ordinary citizens are committed to liberal values. And the good news is that it's very high in most of the cases, right? We see a much kind of lower valuation for this item, support government, which I showed kind of includes in that belonging profile or highly interrelates with national belonging items. And that kind of inverse valuation is really important. It's like a test of internal coherence for me, but I wanted to kind of highlight it here that we should see lower levels of supporting government if you also have high valuations of vigilance. So, and then the last, I mentioned sort of the bucket of belonging, right? So 2 new items I have is, a good citizen speaks German, a good citizen speaks English. And here we see, so this is the United States. So in the European cases, speaking the national language is much more important as an attribute of good citizenship versus the US case. And then when we move to patriotism, So feeling American, British, or German, we see kind of the inverse relationship where, or the inverse pattern, where the United States exhibits the highest rating. So patriotism is very important in the US case versus the UK and Germany. So what we see there, and those are just snapshots from chapter 3 of the book, is that we see high support for lots of norms of democratic citizenship. Most of the variation exists on items of national belonging. But what I want to emphasize in this kind of descriptive snapshot is that, well, I want to highlight something and then raise a question. So the thing I want to highlight here is that these are costless preferences, right? It doesn't cost you anything to say, I think this is important and this is important, because they're, they're norms, they're not behaviors, they're not behavioral commitments. I'm not asking you to sign up for the national, selective service at the end of the survey. These are very costless preferences. They're just kind of beliefs, views people have about expectations of citizenship. So given sort of this high support for liberal democracies, sort of liberal democratic norms, what I then want to do is see if there is a latent partisanship structure to these valuations. Are there differences between labor and conservative voters, people who identify with the partisan groups? Is there a latent structure in who is committed to these different civic norms? And then how these are affected by hard times. So chapter 3 kind of presents all these norms of citizenship. In chapter 4, I show the latent structures, the partisan structures of these norms. So I will briefly, in the next couple of minutes, kind of highlight what these structures are. So in looking at the US, what I did here is I just collapsed all those items into 3 groups, into their behavioral, their beliefs, and the belonging dimensions. Democrats are more supportive of behavioral norms than Republicans. It's not a big gap, but it's there. And if we look at the items, this is driven entirely by attitudes about protesting. So by and large, I would say they hold actually similar views about behavior. In the book, I report by the 14 items, but this is like Zoom snapshot. This is readable on your phone at this size. On the beliefs dimension, so we see that Democrats hold stronger liberal democratic norms than Republicans do. This is driven by solidarity. So Democrats think it's more important for helping people and accepting diversity. But when you take those out, then this is a really important finding. And I should say, like, one of the only positive or reassuring findings I've found in this project. When you take out, solidarity and diversity, which one should argue maybe shouldn't be taken out, but you actually then have really strong support and consensus between members of different parties on things like tolerating people with different views, having friends with different views, right? And those are meaningful values because that maintains the consensus that keeps cross-cutting ties together, that allows for diversity of attitudes and ideas to flourish. So that's actually a heartening finding, I should say. And then on the belongings dimension, perhaps unsurprising, we see Republicans strongly supporting all elements of national belonging, those 4 items that fall in here. So support government, obey the law, speaks English, feels American. There's a strong partisan structure behind the gatekeeping dimensions of citizenship norms. When we move to the UK, we see kind of deeper partisan differences. They're like the US, but stronger. Labor, Liberal Democrats are more likely to value keeping watch on government, vigilance, associations, protesting. And in the book, I sort of adjudicate between how much of this is driven by being out of government versus just being ideologically on the left. Because I also look at these attitudes by Brexit vote, whether you were Labour, whether you were Remain or Leave. And then when we move to beliefs, we see a similar pattern where sort of the liberal democratic core of mutual tolerance remains. So heartening, right? And then when we move to belongings, again, we see conservatives exhibit kind of the strongest support for for items of national belonging. And even, Tory supporters exhibit similar predicted probabilities as UKIP supporters here. Maybe not surprising, it was fielded in 2019. But these are sort of important differences that we see both across party and important similarities we see cross-nationally. Last, I'll show you Germany. Here we see a really strong consensus of support for behavior. So, right, there's not that much difference when we move across the political spectrum, left to right, in terms of highly valuing behavioral norms as a part of good citizenship. Beliefs, we also see a partisan consensus on liberal democratic dimensions of good citizenship. This dimension is highly rated by all parties with the exception of the AfD, an illiberal party, so that is internally consistent. And then when we move to belonging, we continue to see variation across parties. The AfD is unsurprisingly exhibiting the strongest support for these dimensions of citizenship, followed by the CDU, the SPD, the Greens, the left. So it is on this dimension only, really, that partisan differences in Germany's consensus-based system kind of resembles the partisan differences. And in the book, I talk about the strength of party identification in multi-party systems and PR systems, et cetera. So this is kind of to whet your appetite. So the takeaway from understanding the latent partisan structure of citizenship norms is that we do see that the center holds. There is a minimum overlap of liberal consensus, of liberal democratic values, that sort of consensus necessary for national unity and supporting group goals. More polarized systems have more polarized opinions. That maps onto our expectation, and that the right generally is more allegiant and nationalistic. So these are some things that can confirm our priors in thinking about social identity in political contexts. So as I kind of raised earlier, right, these are costless preferences. There's a latent partisan structure to them, but with a consensus overlapping. How are they affected by hard times? So then what the book proceeds to do is to kind of stress test these values. And it looks at how German, British, American citizens respond to evidence of foreign interference in elections, how citizens in these three countries respond to a discussion about the corrosive effects of polarization, be it political or social, on social cohesion, on national unity, on obtaining group goals. So the remainder of the book looks at, use the survey experiments to look at how these norms are affected. And by and large, we see that incumbents largely either don't respond to threat or mobilize against liberal democratic norms when it is in their interest. So what I do is I provide kind of this test thinking about these incentives and these contexts that define interests. And I show, status quo challengers respond more strongly to threat than incumbents, using partisanship to kind of attach people into that equation, and that positional stakes are lower in positive sum systems, so that we see more consensus in Germany as opposed to the zero sum systems. So I'm going to conclude because unfortunately, I just don't have time to go through some of these results, but I wanted to kind of lay out the norms of citizenship, highlight what it is that the book does, and encourage you guys to pick it up. But I will sort of conclude on sort of the three main, takeaways from this study. The first being that threat is political. What is deemed as threatening then shapes the sort of menu of possible options that political leaders will use and or communicate or telegraph to their citizens vis-a-vis queuing. So threat is political. Not all citizens respond to democratic threat, even if democratic threat affects all citizens. And response is determined by your side or your team. Citizens respond to incentives as partisans, not as citizens, so to speak. Even though citizenship is this political identity meant to rise above factionalism. So super depressing findings. Citizens are really an important part of the story, but so dependent on elites for communicating the right kind of message if you want to protect democracy, right? Sad trombone sound. That's it.
Thank you so much. This was, yes, it was very informative. I've been hearing about this project, and this is the first time I've seen you present the whole thing, or not the whole thing, but the big picture of the argument. And I have a few questions that I'm excited to ask you. I also have a few audience questions, and two of them really challenge and ask you to clarify the concept of what you mean by citizen. Whether it's just bounded by the scope conditions of the countries that are, in Western Europe and the United States, with pretty similar definitions of what a citizen is, and shared norms across those states, whether they include non-citizen residents in your definition of citizens, like whether it's participation in civil society or some kind of formal definition. And then whether there's an interesting question, the second question, of whether it matters whether people self-identify as citizens or not. And that is a kind of a bigger question that might push the boundaries of what you mean by citizens, like if you were in the UAE or in other countries beyond these three countries. And so I invite you to explore that conceptually a little bit.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the questions. So I would say that, how do I want to approach this? I guess I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to this project. And I include this in Roman numeral page 1. So really like deep in page 1, like this is in the acknowledgement, or it's Roman numeral 13. But acknowledgements are my favorite parts of books, by the way. And so like I put it front and center. It's the first paragraph. Like I came at this project because I studied immigrants and how they become citizens. And I studied that for, a long time, and studying, specifically what they have to do to become citizens. What are the liberal democratic commitments that they need to demonstrate? What is the knowledge that they need to have, the language skills, etc. And I spent a lot of time, and this was my first book, interviewing policymakers. And policymakers had a very clear conception about what it means to be a good citizen when we talk about the barriers for outsiders. And, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, this is a really clear definition that doesn't apply to a lot of people that are born with citizenship. So if you obtain citizenship via jus soli or jus sanguinis, you're gonna this is something you never really consider, because you have been socialized into citizenship and you have been habituated into what norms are. And some of those norms are like not doing anything, like citizenship. So there's this, there is a tension between, E.J. Dionne has this new book out, right, about mandatory voting, right? Okay, but at the same time, you hold that idea with, sort of the classic Alma Verba understanding that like not all citizens should participate, that like a democratic society should tolerate and encourages like a mix of active and passiveness. So, I'm keeping in my mind that immigrants are expected to do all these things, and questioning whether native born, as sort of the term of art we use in migration studies, exhibit these same commitments or have these same commitments. So in this study, then, in turning the lens from elites to citizens, I'm also, in kind of my own sense, turning the lens from immigrants to native born, to people habituated into the system. And it's really important if in these groups you see low commitments to liberal democratic norms, because we don't have tests for citizens who are born with citizenship. There's no oath of office. And I have this is my hill. I've decided, in the past 2 years, I decided what's going to be the one thing that I'm just going to keep annoying people about. It's going to be this. When you become an adult, I think you should take an oath of office of becoming a citizen, that you accept and recognize that you have civic obligations. And that may be, I'm not saying mandatory voting, but recognize that you are an adult in a political system. We don't have that, but we have naturalization ceremonies. And so it was really important for me to look at people born with status, people who accept it, who maybe take for granted. Someone in the comments wrote, who may not even think of themselves as citizens, right? I wanted to see sort of what the level of commitments, what the level of expectations they held. Because in the end, like, politicians respond to voters. And so it's this identifying this discrete political community and what their values are that is important for defining group goals. That is not to say that people who do not have the status of citizenship, the legal status, of course they're participatory, of course they can participate in meaningful civic behavior, but they just weren't the subject of this. They were excluded in the survey and they weren't the subject of the study.
I'm glad those audience questions extracted that background out of you about your entire research agenda, and then also what you're going to manage to do in terms of reform, citizenship reform. I'd love to see like the actual policy formulations you would come up with if prompted here.
Well, it starts with that, but then the conclusion, I talk a lot about civic education and what civic education can look like. Because like, you know, I have probably read during COVID 8 or 9 op-eds that talk about we need civic education, but like civic education cannot overcome motivated reasoning, right? I mean, and that is like a central problem. And so it's thinking really creatively about what our goals are for civic education. Like nobody wants to learn about the missions of California. I can tell you that right now. That includes my 4th grader, that includes me, that includes everyone in this class. But like maybe we also think about civic education as like media literacy. And we think about civic education as building debate skills and critical thinking, right? So the conclusion really thinks about kind of policy steps forward that can kind of get to where we want to go with maybe without labeling it as such.
Yeah, I also had a 4th grader, and I was questioning why they memorize state capitals. Wouldn't there be space in there for identifying fake news or something like that instead, in terms of what kind of civic education? It's a really important question.
But then they'll never win college Jeopardy if they don't do
Yes.
that. So we have priorities.
And so, okay, so there are more questions in the chat, and one is a follow-up. So it's like a 2-finger follow-up about what's wrong with mandatory voting. Why not mandatory voting? Why would you not go that far?
Well, I mean, this is a point of, you know, I mean, this is a debate, right? I don't have data that shows. I looked because I got E.J. Dionne's new book and I was like, is this substantiated by the data? And I was looking, I was like, do we think there's time series data from Australia in the 1920s? Like, really, you know, I really went in deep there. But, you know, I think that, and again, this also comes out of my, you know, work on immigrant integration and civic education for immigrants. It's one thing to tell people about their rights. It's another thing to attempt to enforce rights. There is something inherently contradictory liberal about enforcing liberalism. We can teach people about values. We can encourage them and to identify meaning in these rights and values, but it's another thing to mandate the practice of rights. I mean, if we hold anything sacrosanct, it's autonomy, right? And people, I think, should just be free to not vote, right? That the fear of state sanctioning for not voting seems to tip away from the ideals of democratic society.
So I wanted to prompt you. I have a couple political sciencey questions for you, but first, I didn't want to ruin the party by asking them first, you know, in terms of the mood of the room. But one non-political sciencey question, but it's just kind of an open-ended prompt, is I know I failed to say it when I was introducing you about your background, your existing work, but one very fascinating thing is you have 2 books coming out this year. One is a co-authored book on pandemic politics with Princeton University Press. I wanted to ask you to link the argument, the insights, or any correlations or anything from this book to the other book, and tie those together for the viewers and the people who are curious, because it's kind of like the elephant in the room, you know, the kind of democratic decay that has come from a threat of something like a pandemic and all the different variations and perceptions and behavior around that threat.
Right. Yeah. So That is true. I unnecessarily punished myself by writing 2 books during this pandemic. But actually the seeds of pandemic politics came from me kind of finishing off this book because, you know, what I'm doing in this book is a 3-country study that looks at how people toggle between partisan identity and civic identity in identifying obligations. And in pandemic politics, I sort of, I did not study the US before this pandemic in any real meaningful sense, but, I took this comparative background and I'm, literally contacted like 2 friends of mine on Twitter in February as I was traveling back from Denmark, looking around Europe and going like, this is not going to work in the US because people see things, people understand threat in partisan terms now. And so that was kind of like the motivation behind it. And so we kind of got out really early and saw that very thing. And we saw it over time. I have this slide here just to show, we asked these questions in the context of the pandemic also. And we see, the same liberal democratic overlap that I talked about, obeying laws, understanding others, but big differences when it comes to Democrats and Republicans on a good citizen wears a mask. The same difference on speaks English. And here this was taken just after the George Floyd protests and the reopening protests. So both sides were protesting at this time. And so even though we saw protesting on both sides, we still see some of the similar patterns that I found in my book. But again, when I said it was very context dependent, we see that like mask wearing becomes this civic signal, right, to your in-group. And that only increases over time, right? It starts off with a large gap and that gap increases over time. So like the big takeaway from both of these books is that in the US, because in the pandemic, in pandemic politics, we only look at the US, but there are other studies that show sort of cleavages enduring it in European societies as well, that so these party identities, these operate as kind of social identities, and they usurp larger civic goals, or they usurp, I should say, larger civic obligations towards non-group members, which is probably the more frightening implication.
So we have another follow-up question from the webinar participants audience asking a best practices question about which countries could the US learn from if you are thinking about civics education, and not just in a blunt way, but in terms of the nuanced mechanisms that lead to better good citizenship and any kind of evidence-based practices there?
So I have 2 studies that I'm working on right now, two. I'm learning to set limits for myself. One in Germany and one in Norway, and looking at how civic education works. And I think both of those countries offer good examples in terms, and like, honestly, it's replicating the civic education that is offered to immigrants at a K-12 level. If we think of kind of in US primary, secondary level, let me characterize it in more European context. That it's really kind of replicating the understanding that human rights, values, and institutions of democracy are like lessons that aren't valued for history or trivia's sake, but like to be taught in a sense, to be taught in not an experiential way, but a way in which you highlight the individual's role in it. So it's not like a textbook, right? But understanding, so to speak, but it's about role playing, contacting local leaders, learning about individual agency in the political process, that there's much more experiential learning that happens. I mean, but this is so contingent, and like, I should say my second hill that I've decided to be really annoyed about during the pandemic here is like extrapolating from European cases for US understanding. Like, these are just entirely, we can compare values, we can compare civic norms, but like policy learning is just very contingent on a lot of things, one of which is like bureaucratic capacity. The fact that the US system is like the US education system is so devolved and non-standard, makes it really hard to sort of identify best practices in any scale other than like the city level, right? I mean, that's really the level in which decision, I mean, if we've learned anything from mask policies and school reopenings during the pandemic, it's how much variation there is at the very local level and how much non-standardization there is in best practices. So I'm always like very wary in thinking about how we learn from Europe.
While you were talking, I was also thinking, as a parent of an elementary school as an elementary school child, that yes, education is absolutely decentralized in the United States. So it makes it very difficult to make comparisons of best practices to small European countries or Western European or Northern European countries. But what is so interesting of the last 20 years is how standardized curriculum has become. And so it's almost not a state level or public level reform. It's almost a private standards question in a way, about what educational companies are setting the standards. I know it's a huge food fight about how standards are set and what is in the curriculum, but it is a private regulatory question.
Yeah. I don't know how much Princeton Review is going to teach us about being good citizens, but right. But like, the move to standardized civic curriculum, has happened in the past decade or so in Germany and the UK. And so they're centering these questions, taking more seriously that civic education is not history and it starts early, right? So you're starting to see, in England, I think it was in the mid 2000s that you started to see a civic curriculum for the first time. Right. So being a citizen is something other than knowledge about World War II and William the Conqueror from the 11th century. So like it's about sort of positive identification of group values and standardizing education in that sense. So like I think learning is a really important, policy learning and potential diffusion models is something that like may happen in the future at the very local level in the US. Much like how European cases learned about how to give immigrants citizenship from us, right? The fact that you see citizenship tests in almost every country in Europe is something that they learned in the US, right? They literally flew policymakers over here to observe citizenship ceremonies. And I think it could work in the opposite direction. The arrows move in both ways, but at the local level, I think in the US at least.
The next project for you to trace and or promote that diffusion.
I know.
So I have, so let's see, I missed one audience question and then I have a couple of questions for you. So an audience question I missed was about basically the nature of the current threat in Europe right now. So I'm going to read it to you, but then I have kind of a follow-up to it too, so I'll add to it. So today, President Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission said, with regards to the Russian aggression, we must show the power that lies in our democracies. We must show the power of people that choose their independent paths freely and democratically. How could we read this in light of your research? So it's about threat to democracy, and it's many of the diagnoses and frames and explanations of this conflict right now are about democracy and an autocracy. And that's one read, one theoretical lens for explaining it, with a lot of robust empirical evidence so far. But I would also then add to that by saying, yes, there is a maybe threat to a democracy in Europe and maybe threat to democracies, however it's framed, but also there are going to be massive economic shocks in Europe shortly. Massive or very massive, that'll be how it ranges.
Right.
From sanctions and from the shocks from the economic interdependence. Is there anything, I don't want to say predictive, but can you give us some insights potentially into this?
I am reluctant to make up, when I read this statement, I saw it earlier, it reminds me more so about, I think it was David Cameron who talked about, it was this at the Munich Security Conference, that we have failed to provide a vision of society to which immigrants want to belong. And he sort of kind of mentioned that and that's the language that it feels like this echoes, that like, it's very hard for me to take seriously this statement when the EU for a decade has tolerated authoritarian power grabs from within their own ranks. I mean, day 2, I think, of the crisis, I should say invasion. People were saying, well, this, imagine if Merkel had been in charge at this point. Well, Merkel perpetrated a lot of, democratic erosion on her watch to keep Hungary and Poland within. So, on the one hand, I think the EU action on Ukraine it's evolving so quickly, and it has changed so fast in a blink of an, in what would be a long weekend, that I'm still sort of I'm waiting it out to see how much our political statements, how much our intentions, how much our practices. So I still think it's early days, but it's also early days in the sense that it's you have hyper public sentiment, you have strong public sentiment, and people are highly mobilized in this instance, which is kind of a similar pattern to what we saw in Germany in 2015 in response to the refugee crisis. The welcoming policies, the attitudes quickly dissolved 2-3 months later when Merkel was faced with opposition from from the CSU, from her own sister party, about welcoming refugees. So this is still just a really quick moving, it's still a moving picture. So I'm really reluctant to kind of put any sort of flags in the very frozen soil at the minute.
Yeah, the framing of that, I'm deeply skeptical of the EU championing democracy, even though they were very good regime, they were a very good democratizer when it came to EU accession and forcing countries to clean house and things like that. But one of the shocks that's going to be happening to European societies and economies is the rooting out of that corruption inside Europe, and that's what they do. We'll see.
How much do Europeans support democracy when the leader of oil rises exponentially, right? What does the stress test look like? I don't know. And then the debates about, there's so many different policy buckets here that we can think of, right? So here we're talking just about the economic consequences. What about the transfer of the airplanes that never happened, right? Or the refugees, right? So in each, and I think of Ukraine's candidacy to the EU, right? That right now everything looks like consensus. But I think if we quickly scratch under the surface, we're going to start to see and consensus is a great thing in the early days, right? But I think we'll start to see some, as we start to stress test some of these commitments, we'll see some more variation between the member states.
So I have two political fantasy questions for you.
Yeah.
One is, it's kind of messy because I was thinking about it when you were talking, so I don't know how it'll come out, but I wanted to, they both are about threat and kind of variation in what we think of as a threat, because it's just intellectually interesting to me. It's just catnip, in terms of what is a threat. And you talked about that a little bit at the beginning of your talk, different threats from outside, inside, and all of this. But there's a little bit of, when you try to theorize threat, there is where does the threat exist? At what level? Is it subjective or objective? Where does it belong? What is it a feature of? Is it a feature of an individual, a party, a system, or is it actually a security threat or something geopolitical? And so I kind of wanted to just push you about, I know that you have only a couple, actual empirical threats in your or disruptions in your book, but the actual concept may vary in a far greater variation than what's actually empirically in the book. Mm-hmm. And so do you think that would you just say the scope conditions of what you would be comfortable theorizing would be at the individual level in terms of subjective threat perception, or could it also be at other levels of analysis that are threat to actual objective threats to society or party, or can they vary temporally, like short-term versus long-term, immediate versus or sudden or incremental? I mean, I just was thinking in a creative way about all the different ways that could be very relevant, either objectively or subjectively, and levels of analysis. It's kind of a question. I don't know.
Sure. And this is something I discuss in like a lot of detail right at the onset of the first chapter, because threat can be slow moving, incremental, piecemeal. It could, one of those, famous kind of takeaways in studying authoritarianism is like, it's already, you only know it happened once it's already happened, right? I mean, you sort of reverse into it. So it can be inobservable, like imperceptible even, right? So it can be those things. It can happen over time. It can be temporal, right? That these are so context dependent that, asking about a mask question next year would not make any sense. And you might not see, a political response to that. And so what matters, and this I actually talk about in comparing foreign interference in election, because it's 2019 when I feel this, which is already 3 years downstream of the event. And so we see actually very modest effects from both sides in response to foreign interference in elections. Because what are you going to do? Like, it's already happened. There was already bipartisan Senate intelligence reports that showed that this happened, that there was already, consequence-free environment in which this happened. So it actually, it doesn't really mobilize it doesn't mobilize a kind of civic response in the way that it still does in the UK and in Germany, where evidence of foreign interference was handled differently. So how threats are identified. What's really important is that threats get framed by elites. That's a meaningful part of the story, because how else would you know to respond as a partisan or not? So the elite has, the party elites have to see this as either threatening or not. And if they say it's not threatening, it's a case of, or if they like voter suppression or something like that, or vote by mail, right? That's another question that we look at in the pandemic politics book. If you say that this is threatening, if only one group thinks this is threatening or not, you're going to see a different kind of response to it. So it's context dependent, it's time dependent, but what matters is that elites communicate it. And that's also a really important barrier. It's like there's no wedge to get between elites telegraphing cues and individuals taking them. So like if the elites aren't genuine or honest about what the threat is, there's not like a wedge to get in between that communication link, right? So that's like a really disheartening part of it. Again, it's like motivated reasoning. Who do you choose to listen to, right? So you can't, it's hard to disrupt that cycle. There's no Radio Free Europe for Americans. So there's like a way to, so while this centers citizens in a meaningful way to understand what's happening during democratic hard times, it still relies on elites to understand and identify threats in a way that isn't shaped by potential benefits or costs. Right? Elites also have to act as citizens, not partisans.
Okay, I'm going to try to take off my citizen hat and put back on my political scientist hat and not be sad right now. But I have the question I was that's my messiest question is that this is a story about existing democracies and democratic decline or resilience of a pre-existing kind of equilibrium set polity. And it made me think, though, about my favorite of the game theories. I'm not a game theorist, but I like some game theories. I like nuclear deterrence game theory, and I like democratization game theory, like Adam Jaworski's work on like what actually makes partisans get together and power share, or what actually makes groups and societies pull the trigger and say, okay, we will share power, we will accept potential competition and loss. It's one of my favorite game theories. It's one of the best. And so that mutually shared consensus to cooperate actually exists in a threat environment. It's a threat environment of some kind, right? It's an environment of uncertainty, perhaps, that's affecting all parties, and it's one where they don't know if they'll win or not. And so I was thinking about that, like there's some kind of U-shaped curve here, if we're going to theorize or something about threat, that threat might prompt democracy, but it might also undermine it. That's a comment and a question, and that's all I have to say, but I wanted to hear you speak.
I wouldn't classify uncertainty as a type of threat. I mean, it's a kind of threat in the sense of like party survival for a certain threshold, right, of certain subset of parties. But I wouldn't describe it as a threat because we have values of like institutional turnover, governmental turnover, and institutional forbearance, right? People participate in elections with the possibility of losing every time. That's what makes it competitive, and the idea that then we can freely transfer power is what makes it democratic. So like that's not a threat because that's inherent to the system, right? That doesn't undermine the rules of play. The thing that undermines the rule of play are when competition is not fair, right? Or participation is not fair. So I don't know what to say about the U-shaped theory, but that's my comment to your comment.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, but something also varies that makes it that the uncertainty is high enough, I guess, at critical junctures, right? To prompt democratization. That's at least that theory, right? About why democratization happens in the first place. Because it's a step down from whoever has power before democratization.
That's right. I mean, in terms of thinking about transitions to democracy, I would, I guess when I think about what the preconditions are that make that competition possible, like Dankwart Rust, I would say it's national unity, that you need consensus about common group goals. That's a prior to a democratic transition. You have to agree what the goals are. So then if you agree that the goals are competition and participation, then you can transition. But the agreement has to happen first. You have to overcome family differences, and that's kind of how he talks about different families of interest groups. You have to overcome these kind of patriarchal and family differences to agree on common group goals, that you share a set of political values. Then you can proceed with transition.
Well, I would love to extend this conversation and have you write like 5 more books on it, but I know that you're tired because you've written 2 books this year.
Yeah.
And they're relevant and timely, and your voice is extremely important and singular on this. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciated the questions. They were really provoking. Thank you.